and welcome back to DevGameClub, a weekly podcast in which two veteran game developers look at games from the past to discuss their relevance and impact today. Today, we're looking back not at a game, but at nearly a year of podcasting. I'm Brett Duville, and I'm joined as always by my co-host, a man who puts the old in Old Lang Syne.
Tim Longo.
Yep, I got you, sir.
Yeah, I guess it's that time of year.
I don't want old acquaintance to be forgot. So,
you're the one. I have an admission. What the heck is that song about again? Other than old acquaintance being forgotten, and what is that saying? Is it?
It means in times gone by, or like if you say in Old Lang Syne, what you mean is like once upon a time. It's Scottish. It's from, I believe, Robert Burns, the poet.
Oh, okay. Never knew.
Yeah. So
I always kind of just jumbled the words as someone was singing, kind of.
Yeah, well, you can. I mean, because at that point in the evening, nobody's really paying attention to anybody else except maybe the person they're kissing. So
that's true. Yeah.
Thankfully, that's never been us. So that's good.
Yeah.
Anyway, yeah. So we thought, well, actually, why don't you? I've been talking. Why don't you tell me what we're doing?
Well, yeah, and we thought it would be cool to just do, a lot of podcasts in general, but gaming podcasts specifically tend to do some sort of end of the year, recap or episode, or in some cases, series of episodes, just to kind of recap the year. And with a lot of the press sites and such, journalistic sites, they tend to do their sort of game of the year episodes. And that's not really us, right? We're not really, we're not about the relevant modern stuff. We're talking about the old stuff. So we thought it'd be cool just to kind of do a recap of our favorite moments across the year, because this is our first year, and we're kind of probably a little flabbergasted that we lasted this long. And
I thank the audience, because they've been propping us up.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, the reception is well beyond what I would have thought. The two fools like us would have been getting. So it's been cool to look back at the year and kind of just think about our favorite moments. I mean, truthfully, every interview we did, I think we kind of both jokingly said, each one, the whole episode was awesome, just listening and talking to each of the individuals. So part of what we'll hit today is our favorite interview moments from each of our interview episodes, which were, for those who may not have listened to the podcast, those are the final episodes of each series. We talk to somebody who actually worked on the game that we played. And then the other thing we're going to do is talk about a couple of our favorite takeaway themes or pillars, because obviously it's been a pretty educational year for us as well, because we've gone back and played some games we haven't played and some that we have, but we've kind of thought about them and talked about them differently than we probably ever have. And I know for me at least, some themes came up that were a little unexpected, and I, even 20 years in, I'm still learning things about game development, and so it's been refreshing. So we thought a recap would be a fun thing to end the year on.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's going to be kind of a, like 80s sitcom style, where after a couple hundred episodes, you just kind of like take snippets from all these other episodes to stitch an episode together.
Family ties.
So Family Ties style. Like, remember when Michael J. Fox was, 6?
And you're going to do some sort of audio woobly effect as you fade into
like Scooby-Doo.
Yeah, Brett has graciously volunteered. By the way, as a year in recap, I just want the audience to know Brett does all the work. I might have been it might have been my initial suggestion to do it, but he has taken on the burden of everything. He edits everything every week. He puts the show notes up. I share in a couple other things, but really he does 90% of the work. So thank you, sir, for taking that on, because we're 40 episodes in or something, and it's all you on that.
Yeah, so. We are. Well, this is episode 42 with a couple bonus episodes that we kind of threw in there as we went. So yeah, thank you. It's fun to do. It's fun to listen to it over again and to take notes, and in particular to be able to pick on Tim in the show notes, because I know we won't read them. So.
Although in researching for this episode, I did go back and finally read a couple of those.
Yeah, well, it's a lot easier to find where certain segments start and end if you go back, because I put the times in. So,
yeah.
So it does help. I'll go first with my first interview moment.
Yeah.
Because my first interview moment is from our very first interview. And that's with Ken Levine talking about System Shock 2. We asked him about why there were so many intersecting systems in System Shock 2. And he made an analogy that I'll let him make again.
So how did you, as a guy who had been working in the industry for a pretty short time, how did you get around to making this thing? It's such a broad question, but literally from a design standpoint, what was your process for building this thing that is so many, like we've talked about on the show? It's like 5 genres, when you look it up. It's a survival horror, and it's first-person shooter, and et cetera, right? It's all these different things. Yet it doesn't feel kitchen sinky. It doesn't. It's not like a Bethesda game.
Now that you asked the question, I think maybe we did think about we thought about the audience in this sense, and I think about this aspect of thinking about the audience led us to the game design, which was we knew the engine was strong in some ways and not very strong in other ways. We knew, as a competitor, we knew we couldn't really make a shooter because we would get crushed by Quake. We knew it wasn't really multiplayer. Well, originally it wasn't supposed to be multiplayer at all. It wasn't fast. I think you guys talked about it on the podcast before, about being just a renderer. It actually had a lot of game systems in it as well, and the systems allowed for a lot of objects in the world, but they also were very, very slow to spawn objects. So, for instance, I think when you fired a machine gun, it would take literally 160 milliseconds to spawn a bullet.
Oh, man.
And, for each round of that machine gun. So you really had to rethink what kind of shooter you were making because it had this very complicated hierarchical object system, which was great for Thief and not as good for this. So we had to there were certain decisions we had to make. So we said, well, let's not make a shooter. We like first-person games, but let's make a shooter that, it has, instead of a few systems that are really tightly tuned like Quake, we know we can't rely on any one thing that much, so let's just build a lot of things, and hopefully people won't notice how broken they are. And that's what we did. I think they're probably, if you looked, feature for feature, probably a lot of those features didn't have as much polish as you'd see in a lot of games that had fewer features. But we built enough of them that together, it's like, they make fish stew out of old fish, right? You have a bunch of kind of rotty old fish, and you throw them in there and you make a stew. And all of a sudden, together, you're getting a nice melange of stuff, where maybe those pieces of fish wouldn't have held up so great on the plate by themselves. It's sort of like a fish stew.
So that analogy to me makes a lot of sense when you consider how that game was made, with this small team just bashing away at it really hard for only a little over a year. 14 months is an extraordinarily short period of time to make a game of that complexity.
Yeah.
And so they didn't have a lot of time to deal with any particular element. That one really stood out to me listening to it again. I also note that later in the episode he described working on so many levels, having so many different levels in the game, as just spreading butter thinner on the bread. So I don't know if we caught him before he ate that night or what, but he was all about the food analogies.
Food analogies I actually use day to day, even today at work. They really work.
Yeah, no, they do.
Recipes or using similar ingredients for multiple different recipes. You know what I mean? Like a pizza, you can make different pizzas, but.
Well, and it's a common human experience, right? To talk about things in terms, it's something at least all of us have to do that's kind of interesting, or can be. It's not like sleeping. Well, we all have to sleep, but it's all kind of boring. So what's your first interview moment?
My first one, I will admit, I'm a little biased about because Janos is a friend, and I just have always liked talking and interacting with him, and so I went back and I hadn't listened to the episode since we did it, so that was also refreshing and fun for me to go back and listen to him because he's such a Janos Schlosser. He was one of the creators of Hitman, and when we played Hitman 2, which was the second game that we played, we brought Janos on, and he talked about sort of the early genesis of IO Interactive and Hitman as a character and as a franchise, and he's just such a thoughtful guy and just loves talking deeply about stuff. I've always found him to be that way.
Yes,
so.
I re-listened to his as well in preparation for this. I thought you might pick one. And we actually didn't confer until we sat down this evening, so we didn't know if we were going to step on each other's toes. But what specific moment did you?
So specifically, I think the big surprise for me, which even though he and I had talked about Hitman in pretty great depth while I was working on Tomb Raider with him, he never told me this, but he brought up Icarus as the myth of Icarus as an inspiration for some of their early thinking, and then that kind of led into a little diatribe that he talked about with technoanthropology and sort of tone and theme and the iconic aspect of what they were trying to get with the Hitman as a character, Agent 47. And then he kind of ends with a little moment where he talks about how they came up with the inspiration for the bad guy and his personal experiences. Do you remember that?
I do, yes.
with this guy, and so I'll let Janos walk us through that.
Actually, but we decided to create this slightly controversial character, an anti-hero type of character, and I wrote the very first synopsis for this game. It was very easy, very straightforward story. It's a patricide story, as you know. So right. This is a bunch of fathers creating this. Kind of a monster, It's. I think you've been mentioning Frankenstein. I don't think Frankenstein was the inspiration for this story. I think it's more like the Icarus. No, it was Icarus myth.
Interesting.
Was the inspiration.
Cool. I never knew that. That's
it's kind of, you shouldn't, we humans, we tend to mess up everything, if we build submarines, they never submerge, we build aeroplanes, they fall out of the sky, but we keep going. And finally, there was this discussion back then in late 90s about cloning. And I think there was a Chinese company. They've been seriously talking about creating a subhuman race, genetically engineer subhuman race as a workforce. And I think it was so infamous, So we thought this was kind of a great story. So what about you break that commandment? You shouldn't recreate God's image on earth, and someone does that. And this person turns against them. So it becomes a patricide story. This was kind of the basic of it. And we thought it was kind of far out at the time. But if you look at what we're cloning today and how far we got, I think reality is catching up on Hitman, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really wild. Icarus, huh? I would not have reached for that. It would have been a deep, deep cut for me.
No.
That's terrific.
Yeah, we've been talking about, already then we've been talking about what you call techno-anthropology. So this is the effect of technology on cultures and vice versa. And it's a very hot topic today. It wasn't that hot topic back then, so it felt kind of stretched. It felt a bit strange. It felt a bit awkward, but I thought it came very well through. And because of the background of the guy, you could go further than you could in politically correct computer games. So we thought it was a super subject.
Well, it is. I mean, it's such... I mean, obviously, you listened to the episodes while we were playing, and we brought up various times sort of the canon of the series and kind of the background of it all, and there's a lot of crazy concepts in there that I know we've talked about in the past when we were working together and stuff. And it's such the Icarus myth is an interesting thing that you and I had never talked about. So that's a new piece of information that's super cool. But also, Brett and I talked a few times about kind of almost the tone of the game, and there's a lot of kind of almost weird and unexpected themes in there that you just weren't finding in games at that time.
I mean, this is
like
not
you said,
James Bond. It's like John le Carré instead, right? It's that sadder, life, feel.
If you look at some of the themes, you look at the sanatorium. Well, my background is from Eastern Europe, and I grew up under a communist regime. It was quite an experience, I tell you that. And some of the neighboring regimes were even worse than the country I grew up in. So you look at Ceausescu's Romania, and you realize that this guy, he actually chased down orphans and trained them for his Securitate, his police force. This is what he did, because the types you train the best is the types without any love or any parents or any influence from ties that matter. And I saw the other guy, Ortmeyer. This is actually a guy I knew in Hungary, so I stole the name, changed it slightly. But I thought the person was so devilish. I wanted him in a computer game and shoot him over and over again. So he ended up in Hitman, and in real life he was a psychiatrist. But as you know, the regime used psychiatry to mistreat dissidents, so people who had a different perception of what is right and what is wrong, or had a voice or tried to have a voice. So he came into this story and he got killed for it. So I kind of, it's a great satisfaction, to be honest. I know it's super childish as such, but I actually love the fact that I can shoot him in the face, So
yeah, that was a great segment. I wondered if you would pick that one when you said Janos, because it was probably the one I would pick, because I remember him, I remember us talking about Frankenstein and how surprised we were when he said Icarus. Because he says in the interview that's like, it's, and I'm not listening to the clip now. When you kill your dad, patricide. He says it's patricide tale, right? Yeah. And I, at the time, I was like, well, how is that not Frankenstein? It was like that's the first thing that we thought of. But yeah, it's a great clip of kind of like where they're coming from and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And it's actually interesting. It's funny to have that come up, because today I literally, in a totally different context, but with game developers, I mentioned Scylla and Charybdis as an analogy. I was saying that
one that well.
Okay, so that's from Odysseus, right? And he goes and he passes through between the Scylla and the Charybdis, and that's right. One of those is like an eddy that pulls the ship under into these rocks, and the other, I think, is a sea monster of some kind, and nobody knew it.
Rock in a hard place.
Exactly. Yeah. But nobody knew the reference.
The original reference. Yeah, we all use Rock in a hard place. We don't know where it came
from. Right, but nobody knows Scylla and Charybdis, I guess. So it's pretty. I was like, them. I did. They were like, what are you talking about? Well, I felt a real kinship with Janos when he brought that up. So anyway,
myths.
Myths. Well, it's part of what we work in. Whether we know it or not. I mean,
no, it totally is. I just
certainly for you, talking about archetypes often, and in your sort of enemy design and things like that. And I definitely remember on Republic Commando talking about archetypal characters, which is kind of a myth construct. So
yeah,
definitely.
So what about your second one?
My second one comes from our Day of the Tentacle interview. Mm-hmm. And, naturally you would think that would be Tim Schafer because he's often so comic. Like, we see Tim a lot, out in front of being an advertisement for his games and things like that. We don't hear nearly as much from Dave Grossman, who also is quite funny. And this actually ties together a bit with kind of my theme from several of these interviews, which was people just not really knowing what they were doing or getting themselves in for, just like how much they had bit off. And so we asked Dave, and Tim why they went with this sort of almost open world structure that we really appreciated in Day of the Tentacle. And here's what he had to say.
All that stuff. One of the themes that we talked a lot about in the series for this game, we obviously talked a lot about the puzzles, and I tend to be I like systems design quite a bit, and so I think that way initially. And obviously, this isn't really a systems design kind of game, but one of the things that when it came to the puzzle structure and the world structure of the game that we both, I'll speak for Brett a little bit here, but he can jump in, that we both forgot about not having played it ourselves for so long, since basically I think neither of us had played it since it had come out as well. And the world structure, my memory from Monkey and even from Grimm and from some of the other games is there was a much more of a, I don't know, for lack of a better term, linear feel to at least chunks of previous games before this. But this one, we were both pretty surprised about how kind of open worldly that this game felt, because you could jump around time so much and you could pick up objects in unexpected places and use them in even more unexpected places, in different times and stuff. And I guess starting, and my questions are going to be definitely in random order, but with one of the big themes we talked a lot about was that world structure and that sense of that, at least my memory, I could be wrong, was pretty different from the other games of the era. How conscious of a decision was that for you guys? Was it organic? I mean, when you guys were pitching the game or kind of creating the game, like what were some of the goals that you had for that kind of structure?
I think that actually came from inexperience, if anything else. I think we were usually working with an act structure of some type. Like all those games are kind of divided, and they usually have just kind of beginning, middle, end. It's usually some variant of a 3-act structure or a 4-act structure or something like that. And the thing about Dot is just that almost all of it is the middle. Like the first act is mostly that 7 minutes of cutscene that you see right at the beginning, and then there's a tiny little interactive part in the middle, and then they get sent through time, and then almost the whole game is them messing around the time, and then there's the tiny little end part. And I suppose you could think of the 3 different time periods that you go to as being 3 different acts because they unlock at different times. Mm-hmm. But they all unlock pretty quickly, and you wind up having them all running in parallel. So it's just this one sort of gigantic miasma of puzzles, and it's that makes it harder, because you've got more stuff to think about, and there's a certain kind of tension that develops in your brain when you have too much to think about, and I think that's people get tense playing Dot.
And we go for that. We go for that miasma. We're like, let's make it as miasmic as possible.
Right.
I do remember, like, nonlinearity was always a word that we used. It was like a general, like, that is a good thing. And I think because we had a lot of fun, and people seemed to react really well to the 3 trials in Monkey Island. And we were like, if you look at a lot of games, at least games that I have worked on, since then, I'm like, I think I'm going to try and recreate the 3 trials. Like, there's always like 3 nonlinear paths right off the bat that you try and do. And we were always trying to make things nonlinear, because adventure games can feel really scripted and really like there's only one thing to do, and you're just trying to guess what the designer wants you to do next. And if you can make it nonlinear, at least the player feels like they have some sort of agency. Although we didn't use words like agency back then.
Yeah, so he comes off as, he's kind of, I think a little bit self-deprecating there, but also just like, we didn't really realize quite how complex this was, and how much we were throwing the player all at once. So yeah, I really loved that particular game to return to, in part because there was always something else to do, and so that was a real strength for me. Mm-hmm. We liked the structure generally because you could go back and forth through these threads, but I particularly liked that I would get stuck somewhere and just go somewhere else because there was so much. So
there's always that's it. I think we talked about this on the episode, but part of people's frustrations with adventure games, especially most of them being so linear, it's like when you get stuck, it's just so demoralizing. And you just put it down, but that because of that structure, you could just dabble and like, okay, I'm just going to work on this thing that I was stuck on. And you can be stuck in multiple places at once, but at least you can bounce around. And I don't know why more people didn't copy that afterwards.
Yeah, well, it was getting to be the end of the adventure game era. Yeah, the expense versus audience line was not in their favor. And I think they just got a little too expensive for people to carry that forward. But also the time travel, was the perfect match, for that. Tim does mention, of course, a little bit of the Monkey Island 3 Trials being very similar, but it just isn't quite. It's not, it's not the whole game, or not the largest part of the game. So I like that one. So that's me. You had one more.
Yeah, I have one more. Hard to pick for sure. So the second one I choose is with our Fallout interview with Tim Kaine and Leonard Boyarsky. Early on in the episode, obviously we're going to ask the typical question of, okay, so what was the genesis of this game, and kind of tell us. And we pretty much do that with everybody we talk to if they were part of the the creative force behind starting the game up. The thing with Fallout, though, that I think both of us, Brett, you said you kind of had a third on deck, and it being the same one, basically.
Yeah, basically in the same kind of area, yeah.
Yeah, and Fallout, Tim talks about this in his GDC talk, which, some of the audience may or may not have seen. He may have even had a post-mortem on Gamma Sutra or something, so some of this stuff is out there, but it was fun to talk to him in a more casual way about this, because Fallout, for those who don't know, is very unique in the way that it began as a project and as a game. And it was the note I put down here is sort of the indie spirit of Fallout, which is a weird thing to say because it was built within Interplay at the time, which was a growing company
and a fairly big publisher.
Yeah, and at the time, one of the biggies, right? And the concept that this grassroots kind of project and idea, and he talks about in this clip, he talks about how, or maybe Leonard introduces it, where Tim sent out a mail to the whole company saying that he was going to, have pizza, and he wanted to just talk, which was sort of this code for let's start talking about making a game on the side, but like on the company's dime, sort of, but on their own time. On their own time. They weren't doing it in work hours, and so he kind of walks us through that, and he and Leonard kind of bounce back and forth the adventure of what it was like to create Fallout, because it ended up becoming a huge success for Interplay, but it came from the most unlikely genesis that just never happens. And as far as like talk about mythology, but within game development mythology, like this is a legendary story as far as I'm concerned on a classic game and how it came to be.
Around the end of Stonekeep, they were asking me what project I wanted to be on. And I was friends with Tim, and like he said, we'd been playing some GURPS after hours. And, really what happened was they wouldn't give Tim any resources to make a game. So he started basically sent out an email to the company saying, hey, whoever wants to show up after work, I'm getting pizza. Let's talk about some stuff. So we all showed up. As only 5 of us showed up, you would think if somebody sent out an email to your company saying, hey, let's start a game from scratch, we can do whatever we want.
And pizza.
Yeah.
That more than 5 people would show up. But the 5 people that showed up were basically the people who kind of designed what Fallout was going to end up being. And I don't remember at what point there that I was actually assigned.
It was a while.
It was kind of weird. It was almost, it became a fait accompli after a while. It was just like, well, Leonard's been working with Tim. Let's put him on the project.
Well, at one point, the executive producer called me into his office, and he said, I hear you're using resources here without them getting assigned. And I was like, no, people are working with me after hours, but they could have gone home. So you don't get to tell them what they're doing here at 9 o'clock at night.
Right.
And that worked. The guy, he went, okay.
Just the raw enthusiasm we had. Because I was already almost 30. We were in our late 20s. It wasn't like we were kids. I had a family already, but it was just this weird thing where it was kind of like we felt like we were doing something we weren't supposed to be doing and getting away with it.
And Interplay also had this clubhouse vibe. Like, you could go to Interplay anytime. You could go to Interplay at 3 in the morning, and there'd be somebody there doing something. It didn't matter whether they were playing Doom or a bunch of people with a tap on the Nintendo so they could play 5-player Super Bomberman. There were people all the time. And so even if you felt tired, you could get up from your desk and walk around, and there was like, board games, paper and pencil RPGs, console games. There's stuff always going on, and it felt just very vibrant. Mm-hmm. And it encouraged you. It was like, hey, what are you doing that's creative? You felt inspired to do something. There was all these resources, and there wasn't a whole lot of stuff. It didn't feel like there was a lot to compete against the ideas that we had. So we just did it. Nobody told us we couldn't do it. That's why it got done.
So it's basically like a scene, like David Byrne talks. David Byrne wrote a book, I don't know, a couple of years ago about how music works, and he talks a lot about a scene. Whether it's for him CGBG, what is that? Whatever that club, yeah. You guys had a scene of just people who were entirely into sort of games making, and games playing, and you just you kind of lucked into that. We both got our start in the late 90s, and it certainly still had a bit of that. I definitely still felt that to some degree. We were both at LucasArts, and it was similar. It was a great time in the industry.
I think you could tell. Playing those early LucasArts games or playing the early Interplay games, I don't know. I really believe that you can feel the passion coming through when you're playing a game that the people who were making it were very passionate about it and doing it out of love. I don't know. There's just a charm, I think, that comes through in those things.
Yeah, I totally agree. It's funny, one of the reoccurring themes, because this is, how many games is this for us, Brett? Is it like...
This is the sixth, I think?
Yeah. I feel like every one of the games that we played, they generally have fallen kind of in the 90s-ish era. I think maybe we have an 80s one in there. We played Super Metroid. But this theme keeps coming up of games as... I'm just going to summarize it as games as big business. And I know Brett and I felt it through our time at LucasArts because Star Wars started becoming more of a thing every year there. And so, budgets go up and accountability goes up and executive oversight goes up, and kind of the bigger the business, the more people are scrutinizing all this stuff. And there was this sweet spot there, like you're talking about, Leonard, that, where people were doing what they were passionate about doing rather than the business side of it kind of creeping in, and I don't know. I'm still doing AAA stuff myself, and hope that some of that indie spirit is what the indie side of things is kind of rekindling. That, not worrying as much about that. I'm speaking from no experience in that area, so I'm sure it's really hard to do it that way. But I am envious of that side of it.
Yeah, I think part of it was, I don't know how it was at LucasArts, but we definitely were in this period of transition from games being this niche thing you made in your basement or garage.
Yep.
They had moved to a building, and when I started, I was like employee 80. What are your employee 40? I was like 88 or something like that. It was less than 100 people. By the time we left, there was like 1,000 or 600, something like that.
Wow.
So we kind of it was that sweet spot where it was a big business, but they were still trying to figure out how to make that transition over to running it like a big business. Mm-hmm. So it kind of it really was a confluence of being at the right place at the right time for all of us. I had taught myself how to do 3D because it just looked like an interesting thing to do before 3D was a huge thing, and that put me in a position where I could art direct this game now that all of a sudden we were going to be making games in 3D.
Yeah.
So it really was just this confluence of events that none of us could have planned.
Yeah, it's an interesting time, and I think the games that we're trying to pick some classics that have really had influence on on the industry and on the medium, of course. And to your point, the spirit of a lot of the games we're playing I feel like are kind of swimming around in the same pool of the types of influences that kind of, people taking big risks, and doing things they didn't realize they were doing at the time. I'm sure that's the story for any sort of, classic piece of art or medium, of any medium. But it's an interesting era there. And some of the games were coming out for Brett and I were coming out as we were getting into the industry or in the industry too. So it was fun to watch that stuff from within as well.
I think, at the very beginning, we didn't know it would turn into what it turned into. But even while we were making the game later, and we had resources and a budget, and I had to make producer reports and all that, it wasn't until about 6 months before it shipped that we heard that people in QA were being asked to come in on the weekend and work on another product, and they were getting paid to do that. And some of them were turning it down and coming in on the weekend anyway to play Fallout just for fun.
Oh,
wow.
So
and I was like, that is amazing. I wouldn't even talk to one of them. Like, you could be here making double pay. And he goes, yeah, but I want to finish the game. I want to see what happens at the end.
Yeah, I like that one a lot because I feel like, to the point of some feedback we had, I don't know, a couple weeks ago about being passionate in the industry.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
this really ties into that very well, and how I definitely feel like there has been a shift, and we kind of talked about this on that show in response to that feedback, where it was kind of Wild Westy. Many of our clips here have been like about the Wild West nature of the show. of the industry at the time, and how that just kind of brought in young, energetic, passionate people who made stuff, often not really knowing what the heck they were doing, and trying to go to some schedule. So yeah, I think that covers it really well. And of course, they had lightning in the bottle, and they didn't even really know it.
Well, and Tim, in that clip, in the first part of that clip, he actually mentions Wild West.
Yeah, he says that explicitly. Yeah, and so did Ken Levine. I think not in the clip that I had, but I think he mentioned it. That came up in that episode as well. So it just like that was probably the one theme I picked out multiple times. Looking back on the year, was Wild West, and I bet Janusz would have said it too, except that he's European. So he doesn't have a Wild West.
The Bolshevik Revolution or something.
Yeah, that's right. Something different. He did reference Ceausescu's Romania. So he has his own touch points. But yeah, for us it was all the Wild West. Yeah. All right, it's time for takeaways. Why don't I went first? I guess for interview moments. Why don't you go first for your takeaway?
Okay, yeah, both of my takeaways are actually from two unexpected games that I actually am happily surprised that these are the ones that when I kind of went back through my notes, skimming and kind of like trying to jog my memory on the things that kind of spiked for me, these two stood out, and they're not from games that I actually would have thought, because I figured I'd choose something from one of the games that I suggested we play, like Hitman or something like that. But the first one is from Metroid, and I am a big Metroid fan, but I'm not an uber fan. And though I had frustration with the game, we did talk a lot about the sort of key pillar of the interconnectedness of systems, skill, and collection and world design. And I look back over the year and at that game, and I have a couple people, friends at work that do speed runs of their own on that game like every year, kind of as an annual thing that I found out after the fact. And it's really like obvious to me now why people do that with that game, because it is a clockwork, of a machine, and there are definitely some flaws, but as far as like how all of those things interrelate, and the pillar of, whether it was conscious for them or not, the pillar of having those things so tightly coupled, gave me just this refreshed and somewhat, in some cases, brand new respect for, we throw around the term Metroidvania pretty lightly these days. And it is actually a pretty difficult and crazy thing to succeed at. And,
Yes.
Any modern game these days, any good one probably has a little bit of it in there regardless. But to have the whole game really so tightly coupled with each of these really important facets that in and of themselves, a game that's heavily systemic or heavily skill-based or heavily, kind of complicated world structure design-based, any one of those things is plenty. But this Super Metroid has all of them, and they're all interrelated. So that one still blows me away, kind of after we had talked about it so deeply.
Yep, it's a great game.
Yeah, that was my first one. So what about your first one?
I actually picked things that you identified rather than things that I took away, which isn't something we agreed on. But it's just there were things that struck chords with me in both cases. And the first of those is actually, it could apply to Super Metroid. I was specifically thinking of Final Fantasy IX. It also would apply to Resident Evil. So there were 3 different times where this came up to some degree. Maybe not to quite the same extent, I think, as in Final Fantasy IX. But that was the sort of handmade moments that really made up a lot of the play in that game. Things that were interactive, minimally interactive, like clicking through dialogue, but kept you in there. But also just the little silly mini games that were a total one-off in the middle of this RPG adventure. And we did talk a lot about JRPG systems and things like that. But the thing that I remember identifying with and taking away, and actually it had called back, and this is probably why it resonated, it called back to the first time I played it, was just how specially handcrafted a lot of the moments in that game felt.
Yeah.
So that one stood out for me in a major way.
Yeah, and I'd say that's also, like you said, it hit multiple games that we played this year, and
especially the Japanese ones.
Especially, I think, of that era as well. Yeah. And I feel like it's rarer and rarer that we're going to see that kind of stuff. Although Naughty Dog, I think, still does it, obviously to a great degree, but kind of different versions of it. But yeah, it's just the love and care that goes into a game when you see so many custom moments like that. You really know that they're all kind of sitting there thinking about how they want this particular 5-minute sequence to go, and really handcrafting it. And you just don't do that as much anymore, and it's too bad. It's nice to see that. Yeah,
I mean it's partly an expense thing.
Totally.
And we definitely think, and this is not to discredit the Halo franchise at all, but that was the 30 seconds of fun repeated, right? I mean, that's where that really started to get real currency, I think.
Jamie's famous talk and quote. And I guess the funny thing for me as a designer that I'm really kind of mixed about this, because I love this takeaway that you're bringing up. The thing that I'm mixed about is I would like to think of myself and tend to want to lean toward emergent systemic design as my favorite, because I think it's much more has much more agency for the player, and there's a lot more interesting things can happen. Right. But it does mean generally that there will be less handcrafted or fewer handcrafted things, and so you kind of got to take one or the other. You don't have to take one or the other, but yeah.
Right, sure. I heard a good description of, I think it was Far Cry 4, and this was from the marketing materials, but it was they think of it as an anecdote generator.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, often the case with systemic games.
Yep.
That you get lots of little anecdotes, and that was one thing that Ken Levine brought up too. But the handcrafted, for specific emotional impact is often the thing that gets to me, and that I remember years later.
Yeah, they're memorable in different ways.
Yep. Very true.
And they're shared, right? The anecdotal stuff won't necessarily be shared because it's going to be unique to you, so it's a little more selfish of an experience. But for something like Final Fantasy, when we're both swinging in the cage, that one swinging cage moment, we both can talk about it and share that moment because we both experienced it in the same way. So I think that a nice healthy mixture is a good thing.
Okay, so
my second one also came from a game that I wasn't sure what kind of takeaways, before we started playing it, I wasn't sure what kind of takeaways I was going to have, because I kind of, in my sort of rose-colored glasses, I kind of just remembered Warcraft being pretty simplistic and kind of just really basic, because it was the first one. It was one of the early versions of this game as a genre, or these games as genre, and I really kind of wasn't expecting to think too deeply about the game. But one of the things we talked about in those episodes, and I had in my notes and refreshed my memory on, is there's a lot of sort of methodical, slow, tactical, if you want it to be there, gameplay in that game. There aren't that many types of units. There really aren't that many, really unique features. It's really, when you list everything out, it's fairly basic. But I was really surprised about the depth that they got out of a relatively few number of behaviors and features and abilities and things with the units. And if you play on kind of the normal speed, the sort of methodical just positioning matters, and
everything matters.
who is in the front and who is in the back, and choke points and all of this stuff that I kind of in my memory just remembered it being a jumble, and I was just and I think what had happened is I had started merging all of the craft games together into one set. And these days, you just make a bunch of stuff and you just throw it at the engine and let the AI work it out. But you couldn't do that in that game. Like, you could, at a point, I guess, if you got once you had a lot of money, you could just make a bunch of units and pretty much win. But the early mid-game, you actually had to really, micromanage particular units and really, position them. And if one got out of position, then they probably were going to die, and then, you could fall behind. And the depth, so my takeaway is really just kind of around the depth that they got out of those relatively minimalistic feature sets, and being kind of happily surprised. And so really, the less is more attitude that they didn't really probably think about at the time, but looking back, we can say, you really can still have good design depth and player option depth with a relatively few but interesting combinations of things. So that was that one for me.
Yeah, that's a good one for sure. That's when we were just talking about systemic stuff, and that's the systemic stuff in those games, and it's very, very rich.
That's true. It's kind of the opposite of yours in a way.
Yeah, it is. Well, and my next takeaway is going to be the opposite again, because for me it comes from Fallout, and again this is kind of twofold because it's kind of merging yours with mine. You specifically talked about the consequences of your decisions, and making decisions that you had to see through to the end, from the very beginning of the game to the end, to literally the end cutscenes that they stitched together. And kind of pairing with that, because I think I rounded it out a little bit in that discussion to say, it's because the characters, the NPCs in the world, have objectives that are not a specific moral point of view, but more of a strategy for survival. And they all had motivations that were sensible and readable, and your decisions often interacted with those, sometimes in positive ways and sometimes in negative ways. And those were the sorts of things that, playing through Fallout again, were the things that really stuck with me of I did this thing, and, and at some point, all these people died because of this choice I made.
Yeah.
Or that I didn't come back in time to save them, or, whatever. And that all made sense to me at the time, and I was not playing a particularly evil character, but still these bad things happened as a consequence of how I spent my time or decisions that I made along the way. That was the one that I, again, and it's mostly a narrative-focused thing for me, or sort of a little more crafted, a little less systemic, a little bit more of the sort of choke points in the narrative design, I guess you'd say.
Yeah.
But those stick with me very much.
Well, and
sort of thing
Tim and Leonard talk about their sort of. I think it might hit in the clip a little bit, but just about their early decisions on what their parameters they were going to give themselves, and I think I asked them the question of how did some of the themes like mature and kind of pretty heavily violent game of that era, non-fantasy, like all of those things, and they pretty quickly decided they wanted a mature game, but they also very quickly after that decision decided they wanted, if they were going to do that, they wanted to have repercussions and consequences to your actions. So yes, if you wanted to play, a mature, a-hole or bastard, you're going to have to pay for it. It's not going to come for free. And games of that era were not really doing that much. And I still give Fallout a lot of credit for, I think, paving the way for some of that consequence-based quest and mission and narrative design that people are still trying to crack the nut of today.
Yep. To this day. All right. Well, those are our interview moments and our takeaways that we particularly connect to thinking back over the last year. I am also going to stitch in right here one funny moment. I don't know if you remember this, Tim, but at the end of Day of the Tentacle, in our discussion there, we discovered that we had both played this game in personality styles that were kind of the opposite of what we would have expected.
And so I needed to give it to that guy, and then that kind of, all goes from there. But it's just funny how you make up those little, rules that don't exist.
Right.
And usually it's kind of right, in the front of your face.
Yeah, it's kind of a follow-on from the what we were talking about last time, like what you do when you get stuck. I think the easiest way to not get stuck is to remain open to the possibility that your thinking is wrong.
Yeah.
To just so that you're open to the clues that it's going to give for you. And I think that you and I are pretty different about that, which is funny. I would expect it to be the other way around, given our personalities. It's really amusing to me that you're the one who is like, stuck in the mud about the way things are.
Yeah.
And I'm the one who's I just got to do this other thing. Personality-wise, we're totally different. But when we play, we switch our mental states. It's really funny.
It is funny. It's so funny that you mentioned that, because we are I try to be so zen about stuff. I wonder if it's because I'm totally riffing here on a tangent, but I wonder if it's because the way we're playing these, because we're playing them on a schedule, but also we're playing them at the same time. And I wonder if I feel this. There are a few people in the world that make me more competitive than you. And and I feel like I'm always because I know you're playing too, and I want to beat you. I want to finish first. You know what I mean? And so I get stuck. I don't know.
That's why you saddled me with Hitman 2. I see.
Yeah, I totally forgot about that. You're totally right. It's funny what that game did to me when we were playing it too.
I remember being like, "This is so not Tim."
Yeah,
but you get competitive with me, Tim, and it eats at you.
You bring it out of, you definitely bring it out of me.
That has been one consequence of doing this together. Is, you bring out the best in me, and I bring out the worst in you. That is exactly how I'd expect things to go.
And all the Twitter taunting and the odd Jesus, which I don't think I've said until just now in this episode. So,
but thank you for doing it, because now I can still put in a TTAJ to tie that together.
Yeah. Anything for consistency. And then. And then I forgot one more that just a little mini one that we can put the clip in if we want to, but Bill Roper also told a quick story about where he came up with the name Medivh, which is, as people may or may not know, is a pretty legendary character in the Warcraft universe, and just basically from slamming his kind of writer's block out of ideas, slamming his fingers against the keyboard, which all of us do from time to time, and one of the words that sort of popped onto the screen was Medivh, which is a weirdly spelled, odd, kind of, you could think of it, but not really making much sense of a name. And now he's, in a major motion picture and the star of various, dungeons and all sorts of things. So yeah, pretty hilarious little anecdote there.
And the thing that's funny with Medivh is I was sitting there racking my brain. I remember this very distinctly. I'm like, oh, what is this? What is this wizard going to be called? Was he's a main character? What's he going to be called? I don't know. I'm typing in names on my keyboard. I'm like, oh, this is all terrible. And so I just started slamming my fingers down on the keyboard just to get combinations of letters. And one of them was MEDIVH. And I was like, that looks really cool. That's the guy's name.
Come on.
So, no, that's how Medivh came about as a name. Right? And because it was like, it looked cool. That looks interesting. I have a pronunciation in my head as I read it. It's distinct. It's not a name I've seen anywhere else. It's not coming out of Arthurian lore or anything. But it feels like, as I say it, that feels right. I'm going to use that.
Yeah.
That was great because I saw, I could see you in my mind's eye just with your face white and your eyes wide, how impossible it was that this central character that, you geek out about like crazy and I'd barely remember, right? But I could just see how into it you were. I can't believe that,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I still half don't believe him,
I know, right?
I'm not I'm sure it's true, but it's just it's so funny.
Yeah.
Because he's a hero in Hearthstone, and he's one of he's essentially kind of like their Gandalf,
Yeah,
or
he's a big deal.
Saruman, sorry. So anyway, yeah.
Yeah, he's a huge deal. So yeah, that's great. So yeah, that's our kind of year-end special as far as kind of looking back over the past year. We figured that would be a good thing to do between Christmas and New Year's when people are kind of doing that anyway. And we thought we would do that in reference to the podcast. We aren't entirely done with TIE Fighter, however, right, Tim?
Right. Yes, we have a special bonus episode, which I don't think we've done a bonus episode as an interview yet, but so we still are looking to get someone from the development team on, but we also have a bonus episode focused on talking to two of the key testers. We talked a little bit about them in the episodes themselves. Reed Knight and Darren Johnson were both. I think they were
co-leads of the collector's edition.
Yeah, and they were both on the core original game, but just as regular testers. But they, for probably 2 years or something, put their blood, sweat, and tears into testing TIE Fighter in its various forms. And they have some hilarious stories about some of the competition that the two of them just made up for themselves because it was a score-based game. So hopefully they'll talk about that. So we'll do a bonus episode with an interview with the two of those guys. That'll be after the end of the year recap episode, and then we
and then if we nail down an interview, it'll come out as well, and we'll schedule that based on when they happen.
We'll see how that one, but we'll at least have that bonus one. And then do you want to talk about what we're going to play next?
Absolutely. As it turns out, this year, my game of the year was a game I expected to come out 7 years ago, and that was The Last Guardian. And I won't go too much into detail about The Last Guardian. I am talking about it on another podcast that I guested on this year called Shall We Play a Game? So go find that. Great show. And I have just a 2-minute clip there talking about why I love The Last Guardian. So find that there. In response to that, we've decided to play designer Fumito Ueda's first 2 games. Neither one of them is very long, so we thought we'd play them together. And they are both on the older side now. I mean, it's 9 or 10 years since his second game. So the first was Eco, PlayStation 2 for both of these games, although both were available in a PlayStation 3 HD remaster kind of version, as a single disc. And Shadow of the Colossus, they may also be available for PS4 players. They have a PlayStation 4 Now or something like that service, and they have an emulated service as well. So it's possible that they're available some other way. But for now, I'm playing them on the PS3 for sure, because I have that. And I actually played Eco again a couple years ago. You got any thoughts just looking at those? Those are games that we talked a lot about in the day.
Yeah. They're an interesting, I think that game company gets a lot of credit for, which they should, for, the flowers and flows and the journeys of the world, and they're sort of very thoughtful, very ambient games, but really
pretty minimal
and very minimalistic. But Eco and Shadow, I think, had a bigger impact on that movement of, I guess you could say, art in video games than I think a lot of maybe younger folks realize. And I personally, think they're two of the most important games in our history. So I'm excited. I haven't played Last Guardian yet, and I'm surprised and delighted that it's so high on your end of the year list. So
yeah, it was really, really remarkable to me, and I knew very soon after I started it that it was unlike any experience I'd had over the course of the year. And so it does really stand out. It immediately stood out. And yeah, it's really something. So, I don't know that we'll talk about that game all that much, except maybe to say I see this in it or I see that in it, in these earlier games. But, we will play about half of Eco for the first episode, of our next game series. Check us out on Twitter at DevGameClub to get to exactly where, because I'm going to have to play it a bit and come up with a point that feels like a good stopping point, and try to figure that out against the length of the game. They're not super long games. They are, having played them before, I can't imagine that they'll take more than like 6 or 8 hours for Eco and maybe 8 hours for Colossus.
Yeah, I mean, compared to some of the other games that we've been playing,
compared to Final Fantasy IX.
Yeah, I think doing them both in one series is going to be fine.
Yeah, and I think we'll see a lot of some themes that begin in one and are developed more in the other, or it's just new ideas as the series goes on, and or the two games from one to the other. But yeah, I can't wait to revisit them. They are terrific games, and I hope folks will have the opportunity to play. I'm sorry it's maybe not the most easy to find game at this point, but we do feel like they're very, very valuable to play. And if not, maybe watch a filmed a YouTube version, and kind of get a feel for it. So that you can follow along. And that way it will even take you less time because you won't be fumbling around trying to figure out what to do next. So
they're probably pretty fun to watch, actually.
I bet they are, yeah. I bet they are. In the meantime, you can find the podcast at DevGameClub on Twitter, as I mentioned. And you can send us feedback at devgameclub@gmail.com. Of course, we love those iTunes reviews, so if you happen to throw one up there, make that a New Year's resolution. Oh, I should really get out there and give that 5-star review I've been waiting to give to these guys. So, that'd be great. We'd love to have your feedback. We'll definitely read it on the show. I am at Brett_Duville, and he's
at Tim Longo Jr.
With a JR at the end.
With a JR. No.
With an odd G's at the end. And I guess I'll wish you all a Happy New Year, and we'll see you in 2017.
Yep. Good night. Yeah, those are the lyrics as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, that's how it goes.
It's probably offensive that I say that, but
maybe to a Scotsman.